So today's lesson is making pizza whirls, which are a cross between a pizza and a bread roll. So in my bowl I've got 250 grams of strong plain flour. So that's bread making flour because it has a higher protein content than softer flours like ordinary plain flour, which are used for biscuits or cakes or pastry. So that's my strong flour, and to that I need to add a teaspoon of sugar, which is going to work as a food for the yeast that I'm going to be adding, and then about a teaspoon of salt. So the salt helps to bring the flavour out in the dough. And then I need the yeast itself, which is going to help it to rise. So I'm going to cut this side off a sachet of yeast and add all that dried yeast. So this is easy action, fast yeast. And with this type of yeast, you stir it into the flour and make sure it's well mixed. And the liquid that I'm going to add is warm water. It needs to be at about body heat, and that's the temperature that will make the yeast work. So I find the easiest way of measuring water is actually to weigh it rather than using a measuring jug. So I've got my bowl on a scales and I'm going to zero it. In the jug I've got some cold water, and in the kettle I've got boiling water. So I'm going to add a small amount of boiling water and just feel it. And when I put my finger in, it shouldn't feel hot and it shouldn't feel cold. It should be just about the same temperature as my finger, so that's what we call body heat. And I need 150 millilitres of water, which is 150 grams. So now the water is at the right temperature, I'm going to add it. If your water's too cold, it will take a long time to activate the yeast. If the water's too hot, it will kill the yeast. So it's almost there. I don't want to add too much. Just a little bit more. That's it. That's 150 grams of water. So I need to mix this in. Then when it starts to come together, I'm going to scrape that off the spoon and then use my hands to work it into a ball. So as I said, the bread flour has got a higher protein content than normal flour. So the proteins that it has are glutenin and gliadin, and when those proteins get wet and when they're agitated, so by kneading, they form gluten. And it's the gluten that gives the structure to bread doughs. So that has almost completely come together into a ball. So you'll know when the dough is ready because it will be nice and smooth and sort of quite elastic. So I'm going to roll it into a ball and I'm going to roll it out. So I am going to dust the surface with some flour and a little bit on top of the dough. And then roll this. So I want to get it into a rectangular shape. When you're rolling, always roll backwards and forwards and turn the dough. If you keep turning the dough, it'll make sure it doesn't stick. What you shouldn't be doing is rolling this way, then rolling that way, then rolling that way. Always roll in a direction away from you, backwards and forwards, and turn the dough. You can also stretch it by hand. If you don't like rolling, sort of use your knuckles or stretch it I find sometimes it helps to pull it into a rectangular shape and then start the rolling. So when I've finished rolling it out, I've got a nice neat shaped rectangle, and I've got it so the longest edge is closest to me, and the long edge that's furthest from me, I'm going to brush some water along that, because that's going to act as glue when I roll it up. So now I'm going to put toppings on it, similar to toppings you'd put on a pizza. So the first one, you can either use tomato puree or tomato sauce. This is a tomato and basil sauce. Don't need very much of it. That will probably actually be enough, because if you have too much on it, it will just come out, ooze out of it as it's cooked. So it's just to give a little bit of flavour to it. So you can spread it with a knife, or as I'm doing with a palette knife. And the next thing I'm going to put on is some pesto. You can either at this stage put on pesto, chop some fresh basil over it, or sprinkle over some dried herbs just to give a little bit of flavour. So I'm going to spread that pesto as well. Then, now that's all covered with the sauces, I'm going to put some of my sort of favourite toppings on. So I'm going to start with a little bit of finely chopped spring onion. It can be ordinary onion, red onion, or spring onion. The toppings for this, I always feel like I'm raiding the fridge. I just use whatever I have in the fridge as a filling. So some onion, I've got some chopped up chorizo. So you can use chorizo, salami, ham, bacon. It's up to you sort of which toppings you want to put on it. And I've got some chopped mushrooms. You need them to be fairly finely chopped, otherwise you'll find rolling it up will be difficult. So all the toppings are optional. You can just do it with tomato sauce and cheese, and that's fine. But if you want to be more adventurous, you can put more toppings on. And then I love chilli. So I've got some sliced green chilli, which I have taken the seeds out so it doesn't get too hot. And I'm going to scatter that over. And then the final thing I'm going to put on is some grated cheese. So I'm using cheddar cheese here, but it's good as well with mozzarella. That goes a little bit more stringy. I find the cheddar gives it a stronger cheesy flavour, but the texture of mozzarella is good. So you can use either of them, or you can use a mixture of both of them. So I'm giving quite a generous layer of the cheese. Might as well put all of that on there. Now I've got all the toppings on there. The next thing to do is to roll it up. So I'm starting at the edge that's closest to me, and it's like a Swiss roll. I'm going to roll it and where I've brushed the water along there, roll right onto that, and it will stick it together. So now I need to cut it into slices. Now my worktop is granite, so it wouldn't really damage it to cut on that, but I still always prefer to cut on a cutting board. And depending what your work surfaces are at home, it's probably best that you always use a chopping board as well, so you don't damage the work surfaces. So I'm going to lift that up, ready to cut it, and I want a baking tray to put it on. On this baking tray I've got a non-stick liner. If you don't have a non-stick liner, you can use a sheet of baking parchment, or you can just butter the tray really well. It just helps so they don't stick. And then I'm going to use a large knife, and I'm going to cut it about 3 centimetres wide into slices. 2 to 3 centimetres. Then once you've sliced them, you need to take them up and place them turned on their side on your baking sheet. Leave a little bit of a gap between them because they are going to rise. So the end bits tend to be a bit small and misshapen, but I'll just squeeze them onto the tray. I always think they can be like a cook's treat, sort of tasting bits. So I'm moving them up just so they all fit on. Now the dough needs to be left to rise a little bit before it's baked. So if I leave them like that to rise, they're going to dry out. So I'm going to take a sheet of cling film and rub some oil into it so it won't stick to them. So just a small amount of oil and then rub it around to coat it. And then cover those up. Now they need to be left in a warm place until they've risen. So with my oven, I've actually got a dough proving setting on it. So I'm going to put them into that. And it all depends sort of what temperature the water was when you added it to the flour as to how long they'll take. They can take anything from 10 to sort of 30 minutes until they're ready. Just try and find a warm place. If you don't have a dough proving setting on your oven, try and find a warm place, maybe an airing cupboard even, just to leave the tray while they rise. Because if you leave them at normal room temperature, it will take a bit longer to rise. But I'm going to leave them now while I do the clearing up. So when these have risen, they can go to almost double their size. So I'm going to peel the cling film off them. Now these need to go in an oven that's been preheated. So I've got a fan oven, so I've put it at 200 degrees centigrade, and that would be gas mark 6. If your oven's not a fan oven and is a top and bottom heat oven, you need to put it at 220. But most people, most electric ovens are fan ovens, so that's 200 degrees centigrade for an electric oven, gas 6. So they need to take about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. Okay, the timer's going. So let's have a look at these. I'll turn the timer off. Oh, and these are looking good. They're nice and brown around the edges, so I think the dough is cooked. Just going to slide a palette knife under one, and I can see that that's sort of nicely cooked. I'm going to slide them onto a wire rack. So these I think are best eaten warm, but not straight out of the oven because they're too hot. So leave them to cool for a little bit. Or you can eat them when they're cold at room temperature, or just warm them through. If they've gone completely cold and you want to serve them, just warm them in a hot oven for a few minutes. So I'm going to leave those to cool for a little bit.